My friend's mom whispered, "If we start this, we can't go back," and in that moment, everything I thought I knew about boundaries shattered. It started innocuously, the way these things often do. I had gone over to my friend's house to pick something up, a textbook I'd forgotten, a jacket I'd left behind, but instead of the usual greetings and casual chatter, something about the way his mom moved through the kitchen caught my attention. She was in her mid-40s, gracefully poised, and I'd always respected her as my friend's mother. But that afternoon, something shifted. Maybe it was the sunlight streaming through the kitchen window, catching in the soft waves of her hair, or the quiet focus in her eyes as she arranged flowers in a vase. There was a calm confidence about her, an effortless elegance that I hadn't noticed before. I found myself studying the small details. The gentle curve of her smile when she noticed me lingering in the doorway, the way her fingers brushed the rim of her coffee mug absent-mindedly, the soft cadence of her voice as she asked how my day had been. It wasn't flirtatious, not in the obvious sense. It was warmer, subtler, like the quiet pull of gravity. There was a fleeting moment when our hands brushed as I handed her the jacket I'd come for. Just a brief, accidental touch, but it lingered in my memory. Her skin was warm, and the contact carried a surprising weight, like she was a tether to something familiar, yet completely new. I quickly pulled my hand back, my mind immediately chastising me for noticing, for feeling, for being aware of how good it felt. Even her laugh had a different timbre that day. It wasn't just polite or maternal. It was rich and unexpected, carrying a softness that made me want to hear more, even when the conversation had already moved on. I caught myself smiling for no reason at all, a little foolish, and a little exhilarated. She noticed me watching, I realized. But instead of looking away or correcting me with a polite, "Stop staring," her eyes held mine for a beat longer than usual. Not demanding, not teasing, just acknowledging. There was a quiet understanding in that moment, a recognition that something unspoken had shifted between us, though either of us said a word. The rest of the visit passed in a blur. I left with the jacket tucked under my arm, but the memory of her, her presence, her subtle warmth, stayed with me. I walked away with a mix of guilt and curiosity swirling together. How could someone so familiar suddenly feel so magnetic? And more importantly, why did it feel like she felt it too? By the time I got home, I realized that my mind kept replaying those small details. The brush of hands, the tilt of her head, the fleeting glance that lingered longer than it should. I knew, even then, that this was the first spark of something complicated, something that would grow quietly but insistently, like a tide pulling at the edges of my reason. And I couldn't tell anyone about it. Not my friend, not anyone. It was dangerous, impossible even, but that only made the moment linger more vividly in my mind. That day, for the first time, I felt the pull of something I shouldn't, and yet couldn't resist. A few days later, circumstances brought me back to my friend's house, this time under the pretense of helping him with a project. He had gone out for a quick errand, leaving me alone with his mom. Immediately, the atmosphere shifted in a way I hadn't anticipated. The familiarity of the home made everything feel normal, but her presence made it feel different, intimate, somehow charged. We started in the kitchen, gathering supplies. I reached for a box at the same time she did, and our hands touched. Just a fleeting connection, but my chest tightened, and I caught the warmth of her skin longer than necessary. She smiled gently, almost shyly, as if acknowledging the moment without saying a word. Her eyes held a spark of humor and awareness, like she knew I noticed, like she, too, felt the tension in the air. We moved into the living room to sort through papers and materials. The space was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards under our feet. She leaned over to hand me a stack of papers, and the subtle shift in proximity made my heart stutter. Her shoulder brushed mine lightly, and for a brief second, I felt the steady warmth of her body close to mine. It wasn't overwhelming, it was grounding. At one point, she perched on the edge of the couch to explain something, and I sat beside her. Just the two of us. There was a careful rhythm to our movements, a delicate negotiation of personal space, but I noticed how her presence seemed to fill the room. Her hand rested casually on her lap, but when I adjusted a paper near her, our fingers grazed. A small contact, barely perceptible, yet electric in its own way. I looked up and found her watching me, eyes soft but knowing. A quiet tension hummed between us, unspoken, impossible to ignore. I became acutely aware of the subtle sensory details around her, the scent of her perfume, warm and floral, that lingered as she moved, the soft fall of her hair against her shoulders, the quiet, deliberate way she shifted her weight when she laughed or leaned closer to explain something. It was all magnified because of the intimacy of the moment, and the fact that we were alone. We laughed at small mishaps, papers tumbling to the floor, a pen rolling under the couch, and in those moments, our hands would brush again, our eyes would meet, and a shared, unspoken awareness passed between us. There was no need to speak of it, no need to force words. The connection existed in the pauses, in the lingering glances, and in the faint warmth of accidental touches. By the time my friend returned, I was painfully aware of how much I had noticed, how much I had wanted to linger just a moment longer in her presence. She smiled at me in that knowing way that made my chest tighten, and I realized that these close encounters were already beginning to shape the way I thought about her. That brief afternoon, filled with subtle touches and quiet proximity, had opened a door I wasn't sure I could close. And though nothing had been said, everything had shifted. The connection between us was no longer casual. It was a current beneath the surface, quietly pulling, waiting for the right moment to surface again. It wasn't planned. Somehow, we found ourselves sitting together on the porch one evening, the sun dipping low, casting gold and rose across the yard. My friend was away for the night, leaving just the two of us in the quiet house. There was a stillness in the air that felt both comforting and charged, like the world had shrunk to just this shared space. We began talking about trivial things at first, the weather, the latest movie, the smell of freshly baked bread from the kitchen. But slowly, our conversation slipped into more personal territory. She spoke of her life, past regrets, moments of loneliness, the weight of responsibilities she rarely shared with anyone. Her voice was soft but steady, like a melody that demanded to be heard. I listened, truly listened, the words settling into me like soft rain. She didn't notice, or perhaps she did, how I leaned slightly closer, drawn in by more than just her stories. There was a trust here, a fragile bridge she was building, and I felt honored to be allowed across it. At one point, she paused mid-story, and I instinctively reached out to steady the cup she held. My fingers brushed hers, and for a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the warmth of her skin and the steady pulse beneath it. She didn't pull away. Instead, her hand lingered against mine, a quiet acknowledgement of the closeness forming between us. We shared laughs, but also silences that weren't uncomfortable. They were intimate. There were pauses where I noticed her eyes searching mine, thoughtful, careful. There was an unspoken question in those looks, a subtle inquiry into whether I understood the depth of what she was revealing. My chest tightened. This wasn't just conversation, it was a moment of exposure, of trust, and of quiet emotional surrender. She mentioned the fear of judgment, of feeling like life had boxed her into roles she hadn't fully chosen. I nodded, realizing I understood in ways she might not have expected. There was a vulnerability in her words that demanded care, attention, and an emotional honesty I hadn't often encountered. I felt myself opening too, telling her little truths I rarely admitted aloud, letting her see the edges of my own insecurities. A gentle breeze lifted strands of her hair across her face, and I brushed them back lightly, my fingers grazing her temple. The touch was soft, deliberate, but charged with unspoken meaning. Her eyes held mine, steady, calm, but underneath, there was a subtle heat, a shared awareness of the tension that had begun to grow between us. By the time the sun fully set, the conversation had transformed us. We had crossed a threshold, from casual familiarity to emotional intimacy, a place where feelings could no longer be ignored. There was a quiet understanding that lingered in the space between us, a delicate tension of connection and desire, kept carefully in check by respect and circumstance. That night, as I left the porch, I realized this was more than fascination. It was the start of something complicated, something tender, and something deeply, quietly binding. And though either of us had said it aloud, both of us knew we had taken a step that could never be undone. It was an ordinary evening, yet somehow it didn't feel ordinary at all. I had stopped by my friend's house under the pretense of returning a borrowed book, but the house was quieter than usual. He was out, and she was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared a small snack. The warmth in the air felt heavier somehow, as though it had absorbed all the unspoken feelings that had been building between us over the past few days. I lingered awkwardly near the doorway, unsure if I should leave or stay. She noticed me instantly, her gaze soft but aware, and instead of dismissing me, she gestured for me to come closer. Her voice was low, intimate, as though she was sharing a secret with the space around us. "Could you help me with this?" We bent over the counter together, adjusting a tray of snacks, and I felt her shoulder brush mine. It was a brief, incidental touch, but it left a lingering warmth that seemed to travel straight to my chest. I was hyper-aware of her proximity, the gentle scent of her perfume, the soft sway of her hair as she leaned slightly to reach the tray, the subtle heat radiating from her body. Every detail seemed amplified, almost painfully vivid. Then she placed her hand over mine as I steadied the tray. It wasn't casual, it was deliberate, her fingers covering mine, warm and firm. My pulse quickened. I glanced up at her, meeting her eyes, and she held my gaze with a calm intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. There was no embarrassment, no hesitation, just the quiet acknowledgement of the electricity crackling in the space between us. Her voice dropped, almost a whisper. "If we start this, we can't go back." She didn't need to clarify. I felt it. The weight of her words pressed against my chest, heavy and thrilling all at once. The pause that followed was filled with everything we hadn't said yet, every fleeting glance, every accidental touch, every quiet moment where our worlds had collided and lingered. I wanted to respond, to say something clever or comforting, but my voice caught. Instead, I let her hand rest over mine a moment longer, feeling the steady warmth of her skin, the subtle pressure of her fingers, the quiet intimacy that somehow felt forbidden yet perfectly natural. We moved slightly apart to complete the task, but the air between us had changed. The ordinary chore had become charged, each movement and glance laden with possibility. Even when our hands separated, the memory of contact lingered, a quiet reminder of the line we both knew existed, and the temptation to cross it. By the time I left, my mind was racing. Every step I took toward the door, I replayed that touch, that look, that whispered warning. She had opened a door I didn't know existed, and now I could feel the current pulling me closer, even as part of me hesitated. That day, we hadn't crossed any explicit line, yet everything had shifted. Nothing would ever be the same again. After that evening, I couldn't seem to focus on anything else. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the warmth in her gaze, felt the pressure of her hand over mine, heard the soft whisper of her warning. "If we start this, we can't go back." Those words replayed endlessly, twisting inside me, both thrilling and terrifying. I walked through my day feeling like I was carrying a secret too heavy to share. Simple moments became charged with imagined possibilities. I remembered her smile when our hands brushed, the gentle way she had leaned toward me as we handled the tray, the subtle way her eyes had held mine as if measuring my thoughts. Each memory pulled me in two directions, one toward her, one away, tethered by the weight of what was acceptable and what was forbidden. I found myself analyzing every interaction we'd had. Had she meant that look to linger? Was that pause in conversation an invitation, or just a fleeting instinct? My mind kept returning to the porch evenings, the brief touches, the quiet laughter we'd shared. I wanted to tell someone, anyone, but who would understand without judging? My friend? Impossible. Anyone else? Unthinkable. So the thoughts stayed locked inside, a private storm I had to navigate alone. Even when I saw her casually, as if nothing had changed, my body reacted before my mind could. A brush of her hand against mine as she handed me a dish towel, a tilt of her head to meet my eyes, simple, everyday motions, but I could feel the lingering warmth long after. Each moment reminded me of what we could have, what we couldn't yet act on, and the dangerous thrill of that tension. She, too, seemed cautious, measured. I noticed it in the subtle ways she held herself, how she lingered a second too long when handing me a cup of coffee, how she smiled knowingly but didn't press forward. Her restraint was magnetic, an unspoken challenge that pulled me closer without breaking the boundaries. It made me wonder if she felt it as intensely as I did, if she wrestled with the same mixture of desire and fear. I began imagining conversations we could have if the world weren't watching, touches that would be safe if only we were alone. Each day became a careful negotiation of proximity, every glance and gesture amplified by the tension simmering beneath the surface. I longed for a sign, a permission, a moment that would justify the feelings threatening to overwhelm me. Yet part of me hesitated. Part of me remembered her position, our ages, the moral boundaries that existed beyond desire. I wanted to step closer, to reach out, but I feared crossing the line too soon, breaking the delicate balance that had formed. That hesitation only made the small moments between us more charged, more intimate, more dangerous in their restraint. By the end of the week, I realized I was trapped in a quiet, self-inflicted limbo. I was drawn to her with an intensity one couldn't ignore, yet terrified of the consequences if I acted. Every glance, every brush of fingers, every shared smile had become a test of self-control, a slow dance of yearning and restraint. And somewhere deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before we could no longer deny what was building between us. It happened one evening, almost by accident, though I suspect neither of us believed in coincidences anymore. I had come over to return a book, as usual, but my friend was still out. She greeted me with that same calm warmth, her smile softer, almost expectant. There was a quiet understanding between us now, a shared awareness of the tension we had been carefully dancing around. We ended up in the living room, sorting through some old photos from my friend's family album. At first, our conversation was light, joking about hairstyles and fashion choices that neither of us would admit to at the time. But the air between us was different from before, more charged, more immediate. I could feel her energy radiating as we leaned over the photos together, our shoulders brushing, our arms occasionally touching as we reached for the same frame. Each accidental touch lingered just long enough to be noticed, drawing small, subtle shivers through me. Then, as I passed her a particularly fragile photograph, our hands touched deliberately this time, and she didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers rested over mine, warm and steady. The simple act felt monumental. I met her eyes and saw that same quiet recognition I had glimpsed before, the acknowledgement that we were both aware of everything that had been building, and that neither of us wanted to ignore it any longer. We laughed softly at something in the photo, and I felt her hand brush against my arm in a gesture that was casual to anyone else, but felt deliberate and intimate to me. The warmth of her touch settled in my chest, and for the first time, it didn't feel like temptation or forbidden fruit, it felt like connection. Like belonging. She leaned back slightly, and I noticed how her gaze softened, a subtle smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I'm glad we can just be here," she said quietly, her voice steady but low, carrying a warmth I could feel in my bones. I nodded, my fingers lingering near hers, not wanting to let go. There was no rush, no need to define the moment. We simply allowed ourselves to exist in the same space, close enough that I could feel the faint heat of her arm against mine, hear the rhythm of her breathing, notice the way her hair fell over her shoulder when she tilted her head to examine another photo. It was simple, safe, yet charged, a gentle acknowledgement that our connection had shifted into something mutual, something we were ready to explore carefully. When the evening ended, and I walked toward the door, she followed me to the hallway. There was a pause before I left, and in that moment, our hands brushed once more, light, fleeting, but full of meaning. A shared glance, a quiet smile, and then the understanding that we were both willing to step into something new, knowing the path forward would be complicated, but also undeniably real. That night, I left with a strange mix of exhilaration and serenity. For the first time, it wasn't just my fascination or longing. It was mutual. We had crossed the threshold together, not recklessly, but deliberately, tenderly, and for the first time, the connection felt balanced, alive, and entirely ours. The slow burn we had been cultivating had finally found its spark, and it promised warmth, trust, and intimacy in equal measure. The days that followed were quiet, unhurried, like the world itself had slowed to accommodate the fragile new rhythm between us. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic leap, just a series of small, meaningful gestures that made everything feel real. We discovered that intimacy didn't always need words, it existed in shared smiles, lingering glances, and the comfortable proximity of two people learning each other's rhythms. I would arrive at my friend's house, ostensibly to return a book or help with a task, but now I stayed longer, drawn by the warmth of her presence. Sometimes we sat together in the living room, poring over photos or listening to music, her head resting lightly against my shoulder. I felt her breath, soft and steady, the rise and fall of her chest in sync with mine. It was grounding, reassuring, a quiet affirmation that this connection was real and mutual. We learned to communicate without words. A brush of fingers as we reached for the same cup of coffee could make my heart skip. A soft laugh, the tilt of her head toward me, or a subtle glance out the window could convey understanding, comfort, or desire without ever crossing into overt romance. Every touch, every pause, every shared silence felt deliberate, measured, and full of meaning. There were afternoons when we wandered the yard together, side by side, hands brushing occasionally, fingers teasingly close but rarely interlocking. Each touch carried an unspoken acknowledgement. We were both aware of the risk, both drawn to it, and both choosing to move forward with care. The age difference, the social boundaries, and the complicated nature of our bond lingered in the background, but they no longer felt like barriers. They were just another layer of intimacy to navigate thoughtfully. She shared stories of her past with me, letting me into corners of her life that were private and precious. I listened, learning not only about her experiences but also about her fears, her hopes, and the quiet strength that had always drawn me to her. And I shared parts of myself in return, revealing thoughts and vulnerabilities I rarely let anyone see. It was a give and take of trust, the foundation of something deeper than infatuation, something steady, enduring, and profoundly human. By the time evening fell, we would often find ourselves side by side on the porch or by the window, hands finally intertwined, comfortable and natural. The world beyond the house felt distant, unimportant. In those moments, there was only the quiet companionship of two people who had found each other unexpectedly, navigating something forbidden yet beautiful with care and respect. When I left each night, the goodbye was soft, warm, and lingering, not desperate or urgent, but filled with the quiet promise of tomorrow. We didn't need words to acknowledge what was growing between us. It existed in the calm closeness, the shared smiles, the subtle touches, and the understanding that what we had found was rare and precious. By the end of it all, I realized this slow-burn connection, the careful touches, the shared vulnerability, the unspoken tension, had transformed into something entirely wholesome and lasting. It was a love measured not in grand gestures but in presence, trust, and the quiet joy of being understood. And in that delicate balance, we had found not just attraction, but warmth, comfort, and an unexpected, unshakable sense of belonging.